great to talk at these events because it's very cool to see how all of the talks kind of fit into each other. If Hilmar told us about a particular world and the deep history of that world and the real traction with reality that they've had, and Venkatesh told us about the metaphysics of worlds and how to think about this concept from different angles and the way they leak into each other, I'm going to maybe be more boring. I'm going to talk about something that we make worlds out of, a subset of worlds, but some really important worlds. So, I'm Josh. I work at the Ethereum Foundation, where I work for Ethereum, where I'm lucky to serve as part of the leadership team. I've been lucky to work in this space for a long time. I started working on a Bitcoin wallet in early days that I'm sure none of you have ever used. I ran a Bitcoin ATM for about a year in 2015. Along the way, I helped co-found ETH Global, wrote a lot of blog posts, worked on some early layer 2 stuff, and since 2020 have worked at the EF. And through all of this, I couldn't really explain what we're doing. I can talk about particular use cases, right? Bitcoin makes sense, or DeFi makes sense. But, I started getting involved in this because I was excited about the whole thing, about the whole spectrum of possibilities that blockchains offer us. And I couldn't really explain it. I think all of us, we're doing a lot of this, and these mental gymnastics to explain things in convoluted ways, and we really need to get to here. So, about a year ago, I wrote a blog post to try and make sense of this for myself. And enough people have said that they liked it to think that I should, continue talking and writing about these ideas. And I hope it can make a small contribution to a much larger project. If blockchains are going to have the success that we want in the world, the impact we want, they need to explain themselves. I don't think it's good enough for them to work. I think it requires more than function. It requires legibility and understanding. A way to think about this is that society has a social software that we use to make sense of the world around us, make sense of new technologies. And I think blockchains have revealed an edge case in that software, maybe an abstraction leak in Venkatesh's terms. And I think we need to update that software. So I think this is a proposal, a pull request of Civilization's sense-making software. We're adding some ideas, and we'll talk at length about them, but we're also deleting a lot of legacy code, I hope, and those are always great PRs to see. We are refactoring. So, let me tell you a story. At Bell Labs in the 1930s and 40s, this is Claude Shannon. He was surrounded by the beginnings of this new age. During the war, he worked on fire control systems, signal processing, and cryptography. And this work led him and others to think about this more generalized approach to what we now call information. But he didn't use that word at first, right? In 1939, he wrote to a colleague that he was thinking about ways to talk about intelligence, a word that we wouldn't really use today or the way that he used it then. It wasn't until later that people at Bell Labs started talking about information in this more dry, abstract way as a quantity or measure of a thing. Shannon's paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, was published in 1948 and changed everything. But the important point for us here is that it introduced a definition of information that was not tied to a particular form. It was mathematical, it was abstract, it was general. It could be applied to anything. And it introduced the bit, this measurable, quantifiable piece of information that we can see in anything from music to DNA to software. Now, these historical streams get tricky, and it's hard to generalize, but it's generally true that before this moment, most people didn't think the way we do today of information as this abstract thing that is everywhere in our world. Information was segmented by its medium. It was speech, or it was literature, or it was song, or it was mathematics. These were different things that people couldn't analyze as a field. And if you look at old definitions, you can see this, right? The old definitions of information don't have this general property. They're more specific. Information is just one word among many to gesture at these things. And this has always struck me, right? It's crazy to me that we had information technology for thousands of years. It, is completely there through all of human history. We are made in many ways of language, of information technology. But we didn't have this idea that it's all part of this drier thing underneath the surface. And Shannon's idea changed this, and not just in his immediate field, right? People began to think, well, wait a minute, if this is that abstract, then maybe we can look for it elsewhere. A chemist named Homer Jacobson in 1950 begins to apply Shannon's ideas to biology to measure the informational throughput of the human ear and the human eye. And of course, the big example is DNA. We would not have been able to understand our own genetic history if we didn't have the tools of analyzing information. In particular, Shannon's own ideas about error correction and ensuring consistency of data were found to directly apply to the way that our own bodies transmit DNA over many centuries. So take away from this that there was a time before we had the concept of information, and there was a time after. Maybe we're missing something just as fundamental. So, part 2, clues. So here I am, struggling to make sense of this world that we're in and having trouble. And there are these clues that keep coming up and keep bringing me back to the same place. One of those is that we talk about blockchains as though they're both trustless and that they're trustworthy, right? We see this language everywhere. In the Bitcoin white paper, of course, it talks about not relying on trust. In the Ethereum white paper, it says that the purpose of cryptocurrency is to eliminate the need for trust. But also the Ethereum white paper says that Ethereum can make dApps trustworthy. This famous Economist cover from 2015 talked about blockchains making trust, and that's very common in many, descriptions of it. And Ethereum.org's own developer documentation talks about dApps can be trustworthy. And it's not just limited to Ethereum people and the Economist. Here's Rootstock's own roadmap talking about how there's a need for the network to be trustworthy. I'm not trying to dunk on anybody. I don't think we're being hypocritical. I think that we mean something real when we say that blockchains are trustless, and we mean something real when we say that they're trustworthy. Just that our language hasn't caught up with what we actually know intuitively. Clue number 2. We talk a lot about how blockchains are different from centralized institutions, but we almost never talk about how they're the same. This is very strange the more you think about it, right? The usual story is that, all right, there's institutions, there's fiat money, there's law, whatever, then there's blockchains, and they're a decentralized version of that. But the question is, what is that, right? We only say what blockchains aren't. We say they're not institutions, not centralized, but not what they are. We're skipping over this much more obvious question. And there must be something they have in common, right? In the whole scale of the universe, there's only a couple things we can make money out of that has reached global adoption. There's only a few things we can make contracts out of, and these are 2 of them. They are literally substitutes for each other, and we see that happen every day. So there must be a story about what they have in common. And it actually gets weirder than this, because whatever story we tell also has to explain rocks. We also just use gold and gems and stuff we find lying around in nature to also make a money. So whatever story we tell about why this can be money and this can be money and this can be money, it needs to apply to all of them in some way. So maybe the problem isn't that we don't understand blockchains. Maybe the problem is bigger than that. Maybe the problem is that we don't understand everything else, including blockchains. We don't have a category to place it in. So, let me tell you another story. Human civilization depends, in part, on our ability to make the future more certain in specific ways. At small scales, we can create enough certainty with social and family ties, but at a certain point, those reach their limits. And we wanted to go further than that. We wanted to scale these systems to larger distances and social distances and other things we can rely on. We found new ways of creating these hard, stable, reliable points. And many of our most important pieces of social infrastructure are made out of these hard points. And they've always been there lurking in the background. It's been there with money, invented and reinvented across hundreds of cultures. This temporal bridge between human needs, extending a barter through time, enabling this new form of coordination. Money doesn't work unless there's certainty about some of the properties of that money, that I can possess it, that the bank database stays consistent, and that the supply won't radically be inflated over time. Hardness has been there with money. And it's been there in trade and commerce, because trade is very risky if you don't have some certainty that someone will make your counterparty follow their obligations. It's been there in our laws and courts who enforce them, the systems that provided us property ownership and let people actually invest in the things that they have and have confidence about that future. It's been there in our constitutions that divide power and protect the interests of the individual. We need these hard points because it's impossible to coordinate at scale without them. Just like a skyscraper to reach a certain height needs a certain level of stability that it won't move beneath us, so does a civilization that once it reaches a certain point needs more stability for its social coordination mechanisms. Let's call this property, this capacity to make things more certain in the future, hardness. And let's zoom in a bit. How do we actually create this? What is it made of? Where does it come from? Well, we can observe that there's really kind of three things that we use. One source of hardness is just nature itself, atoms for shorthand. We found objects and systems that had some convenient properties for us, and we use them to make money and many other things. Another source of hardness is one we made our own. We made institutions out of what we had lying around, which was people. People organized in sufficient ways and motivated would be able to follow instructions to give stability to political and economic affairs. Recently, we've invented a new way to create hardness, blockchains. Using this elegant combination of cryptography, network software, and human incentives, we're able to create software and digital records that has this characteristic and necessary degree of permanence. So if law and money and government and all this stuff are the infrastructure of our civilization, then atoms and institutions and blockchains are some of the materials that we build this infrastructure with. We can ask the same questions of them. We can analyze and criticize and assess them in similar ways. And just like an architect needs to think about the right materials for a building, we need to think about the right materials for our civilization. So how are we doing? I think this is a simpler story, right? We need stuff that won't change to coordinate around. We do this already with atoms institutions, and blockchains are just a new way of doing that. If we already had this idea of hardness or something similar, it would have been very easy in 2014 to explain to people what blockchains are for. So that's a very high-level story to give you the gist. Let's talk in a bit more detail. First, a definition. Still working on this, but a definition. Hardness, I tend to talk about it in two ways. One, it's a capability to make a specific outcome very likely to be true in the future. And it's also, talked about as like a measurement of the certainty or security of that specific outcome. And it comes from these certain sources. Now, we're going to walk through this definition and talk about each component to give you a more solid understanding of what I mean here. So first, hardness is a capability, right? We use hardness to make something really specific we want to be certain. It is about programmable hardness. That's the most useful thing to us. And we're not talking here about just everything in the universe that is certain. Most things that are in the universe that are certain or not don't matter all that much to human society. We're talking about a narrow set of things. Think about it this way. When we talk about Earth, we're usually talking about a very small portion of the Earth where everything and everyone that's ever mattered has happened, and not the 99.9% of it that mostly doesn't, right? Similarly with hardness, there's a pretty narrow layer of social skin extending through time that we use to coordinate around, and everything else might not matter as much, most of the time, hopefully. Secondly, hardness is about a really specific outcome that we want that is likely to be true in the future. So what are these specific outcomes I'm referring to? And I call this the cast. I'm introducing another new term. And so the definition here is that a cast is the possible future state of the world that is made more certain or secure using hardness. One cast related to a loan might be that if Alice doesn't pay Bob back, the legal, structures of her jurisdiction will go to increasing lengths to force her to do so. We use institutional hardness to make this cast. Another cast about gold might be that there's a certain amount of gold that will enter the market each year for the next 20 years. A cast about Ethereum could be that this asset can only be transferred if a transaction is signed with the appropriate private key. A cast about an autonomous world could be that this world will continue without its creator. In practice, we're usually interacting with bundles of casts all woven together. If you own gold and have it in a bank, then you care about casts about gold supply in the future. You care about casts of the strength of the bank vault, casts about the strength of the legal agreement between you and that bank, and casts about the reliability and political stability of the legal system in your country. Why coin a new term? Well, it's because we want to be able to talk in general. We have existing terminology for this, but they're often bundled up with interpersonal relationships, like trust or contracts or whatever. We want to be able to talk about expectations that are divorced from the particular material of hardness and generalize across all of them, and cast us some useful connotations that I found pleasing. So, secondly, we can talk about hardness as a measure, right? The measure of certainty or security of the cast, of the specific outcome. This is always measurable in theory, even if it can be quite hard, right? So let's take the gold cast example. How hard is the cast that between X and Y kilograms of gold will enter the market in a certain period. Well, you could measure it as a probability. You could look at all the data and, satellite photos of gold mines and all this stuff and come up with an idea of what the expectation is. And, people do this. Our civilization is quite good at this because it matters a lot to the markets, and you can make money if you're right and everyone else is wrong. You could also measure it in a cost way. What would it cost to create a world where the cast turns out to be false? What would it cost to break the cast? You could do this too. If you are a, nation state, you could definitely lower gold production below a certain level through war or international law. If you want there to be more gold than Y in the future, well, you could go get an asteroid full of gold and bring it. You can pay to break the cast, even casts that seem inviolable today. And lastly, hardness is made out of certain things. And here's where we're going to move on to talk about the reason that something is hard, where they come from, and their different properties. So, atoms, institutions, blockchains. What are the affordances or properties of each of these? What are they good for and what are they bad for? How should we, as a civilization, use them? Well, why does it matter? It matters because, there's a famous Marshall McLuhan quote, "The medium is the message." Well, maybe there's something similar at play here, that the sources of hardness used to make a game's rules define the space of possible play. Maybe it matters what the mixture is underneath the surface. Atom hardness, we've talked about already. It's when we find hardness just lying around in the universe and we repurpose it for our own needs. Gold, shells, hard bank vaults, we make castles, we create physical deeds that are themselves proof of some social relationship. It has many advantages. Enforcement is automatic. It just happens and it's very cheap. There's a persistent shared state that we all have access to and is also fairly affordable, and a universal rule set that applies at least consistently and predictably at human scales, which is where most of the social layer stuff that happens actually matters. But the thing about atom hardness is that it's kind of like if you're an architect and you want to have a cool rock face wall in your home. You can't make one, you just have to find one that happens to work for your home. We can't say to the universe that, gold's great, but give us a new shiny rock with a slightly different supply curve and spread it more equally around the parts of the world that we care about. We can't do that. We are limited to properties that accidentally coincide with human needs. We forage them. Atom hardness, therefore, also has limited programmability. We can't shape it very much. We can shape it a little bit. I can move gold from here to there, and that is reprogramming the computer of the universe to record a new state. But there's only so much we can do, right? And the third point is that casts made of atom hardness are frequently undermined by increasing human control, increasing human technology. As an example, in the 1830s, there was a hard cast in North America that voting results from the East Coast would not be known to voters on the West Coast in time to influence their vote. This cast was atom hard. It was made out of physics. We couldn't talk faster than that to the West Coast. But new technology undermined this. Suddenly, we actually could do that. We broke the cast. In Canada, where I live, this was remade out of institutional hardness when we introduced laws in 1938 that prohibited sharing that information on the West Coast. And in the US, there's this long-standing convention among media organizations to not report results before polls close. Not a law, but another form of institutional hardness. Another example that might be more familiar to you, there was a hard cast in financial markets that trading could only happen at a certain speed because how could it possibly be any different? There was a physical limitation on how fast people could yell at each other on a trading floor. But this cast was broken when we introduced new technology, and suddenly we could trade so fast that new problems were introduced. We decided that we actually liked the previous version of the universe, and so we remade the cast out of institutional hardness by introducing laws and circuit breakers and regulations. Institutional hardness is when we source hardness from people, from groups of human beings who are organized in some way to behave predictably over long periods of time. And it includes, everything you might think of, society and civilization. It includes courts, it includes companies, it includes legislatures, it includes, central banks, contracts, all this stuff. It's all institutional hardness. It's really the story of civilization is human beings making hardness out of human beings. We created castes that gave order by creating criminal law. We created hardness as a platform by saying to people that if you write down your promises, we will make those promises hard, whatever they want to be. We created castes that spawned new assets and created sources of credit for growing economies. Institutional hardness has many advantages. It's very programmable. It can take complex instructions. It's limited only by what humans can do. It's made of people, and people are good. It has many disadvantages, though. It's limited by borders. It's exposed to political or state failure. If the politicians of your country can't agree on something, your contracts might eventually just stop working. Why are those things bundled together? They're usually very opaque. It's hard to tell if a contract actually is hard, even if you're a very skilled lawyer. And it's made of people, and people are bad. Our reliance on institutional hardness has increased, both because of the atom hardness leaking story I told earlier, and because the problem with software eating the world is that most of the time, software is really just an institution behind a screen. Blockchain hardness is a new source. Satoshi's invention was this kernel of something grander, this general purpose technique, not for chains of blocks, but for creating hardness. It has many strengths. It has this universal global access property. It's made of software, and anyone can write software. The degree of hardness is often fairly transparent and auditable if you know what you're doing. And there's very low startup costs. Anyone can submit a transaction to Ethereum, depending on gas prices, but virtually no one can write a law, and even fewer people have access to a legal system that they actually trust, meaning they can write a contract and rely on it. And they're secured by market incentives, and markets are rational. It has many weaknesses, though. It requires a technological civilization. We could only have it now when we have the sufficient industrial base to maintain the internet and understand the cryptography it's made of. It's made of software. People screw that up all the time. And the scope of casts isn't limited to whatever human beings can go out and do in the physical universe. It's limited to what is on-chain and what on-chain things can influence. And it's secured in part by market incentives, and markets are irrational. Last part. Armed with these ideas, it's easy to make sense of blockchains. They're just a new source of hardness. They're an alternative and complement to institutions and to atoms, as they have different strengths and weaknesses and enable new kinds of casts. And they help make sense out of a lot of other things we talk about. Decentralization is what purchases hardness. It is the way that hardness is created, one of the ways in a blockchain system. And hardness helps distinguish between real decentralization and theater. Real decentralization is that which most of the time actually makes the system more hard. It's still worth talking about, though, because it's a main contrast point from institutions. What about legitimacy? Well, hardness is really a lower level than that. Legitimacy is about how people relate or react to something. Hardness is just a dry, abstract property that many things can have. So hardness can contribute to legitimacy, but they are different. What about trustless versus trustworthy from the very beginning? This becomes simple. Blockchains are trustless means that their hardness doesn't depend on institutions or people. Blockchains are trustworthy means that they have hardness from a different source. What about composability? Well, it only becomes possible when developers can make hard casts like this program will always be available and even we cannot remove it. Then you have the confidence, the predictability to build on top of that to build a composable network. What about infinite games? This is really important because there's a way of misunderstanding what I'm saying that is all about creating a more rigid and predictable world. That's not what I mean. I think that adding a new source of hardness can help us escape this local maxima that we're in by creating a new space for possibility and change. Infinite games are about being able to continue play by changing the rules. Well, this is a new way for people to create new rules and to change them that are, I think, cheaper to do than changing laws or tearing down institutions. It's a way of having revolutions that continue at a lower cost, much more globally accessible, not divided by nation-state borders, and to make new rules for games no one has ever played before. And it helps make sense of a divide you can see under the surface in the blockchain ecosystem. Because a lot of people, what they're really concerned about is using blockchains to compete with or replace institutional hardness. That's really what Bitcoin is about. That's a lot of what DeFi is about. That's a lot of what these financial memes are about. But there's another part of the world around blockchains that are about using hardness to do things no one's ever done before, that we have a new landscape, a new tool, and just like when institutions were invented and we could do new things with them, now that blockchains have been invented, we can do new things with them too. Let's find out what they are. They wanted me to have one question. I have 7 questions. I'm almost done. One, something you could help me with is refine and improve this definition. I'm not very happy with it. I think it could be more precise. It could be more formal. I'm not Claude Shannon, but maybe one of you is. The psychology of hardness. People seem to want it to always be binary. I trust it or I don't. Is that a hangover from institutions where we trust people or we don't, and it's about their character? Or is it more fundamental than that? How should we think about this when we're designing systems that use hardness to create something? The world of digital hardness is bigger than blockchains. There's this whole world of programmable cryptography that has many similar but different properties. Is there a useful way of talking about them all together? Or is cryptography more like atom hardness, just part of the universe that we find and can shape a little bit for our purposes? How should we think about the right mixture of hardness and sources? I talked about, this balance between institutions having vulnerabilities and blockchains having advantages, but can we be more specific and precise about what overall set of properties we want in different systems, and how does it change depending on what we're building? You might start with this famous paper called Crystals and Mud in Property Law that is of slightly different, but it's related. We can talk about it if you want to. Fifth, how can we apply our understanding of blockchain hardness to other things, right? Be the Homer Jacobson of blockchains. Go tell us, what is the block space of the US legal system? Apply the measurements that we are familiar with in this ecosystem out to the world around us, because ultimately it's all the same under the surface. 6, when you make a new world, what programmable hardness should be part of nature? If you're building a new universe from scratch, as some of the people in this room want to do, would you want to program in property rights? Would you want to program in the ability to transact or communicate privately? Or should you just give the residents of that universe the opportunity to figure it out for themselves, because maybe that creates more love, more friendship in Hilmer's terms? And 7th, here's what's really crazy. If human control over nature becomes near absolute, as the trend maybe is continuing to do, then eventually most forms of atom hardness are completely undermined. And the only hardness we have left to bring order to our relationships, to our civilization, will be institutional and cryptographic or blockchain based. What would that be like? Is that going to happen? And how can we prepare for it? Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. Have a great day.